Cool. Okay, so I'll go ahead and talk about substantive discovery and naturalistic modal metaphysics. Now, you'll have seen that if you were attentive, that the title has changed slightly from substantive disagreement to substantive discovery. This is really just more a change of emphasis than anything, but I think this makes it clearer where the emphasis is. And it's nice to be giving this talk to a workshop hosted by Bristol, because the ideas in here go back quite a long way in my thinking. I've never really kind of put them into a paper form, but I remember going to Bristol when I, as a postdoc, and talking to Alexander Bird there, and kind of making all the same sorts of complaints that I'm going to make today to Alexander. And he was extremely sympathetic about it, but I don't know if other dispositionalists are going to be quite as sympathetic. Some of what I'm saying is kind of has a kind of anti-dispositionalist flavor to it, or at least I'm kind of curious to see what dispositionalists will make of some of these thoughts. So I'm going to talk broadly about necessitarianism as a view of the laws of nature. This is the view that the laws of nature are in some sense necessary. And I'm going to talk about different versions of necessitarianism. In particular, distinguishing the strong version from a weak version. So this distinction has been around for a while. But I want to focus on the consequences of this distinction for what we take ourselves to be doing when we do what I'm going to call naturalistic modal metaphysics. And I take the project of naturalistic modal metaphysics to involve, at minimum, bringing empirical evidence. Excuse me, I don't know what's happening there. Bringing empirical evidence to bear on the question of what possibilities there are, what genuine possibilities there are. And as we'll see, only the stronger version of necessitarianism really makes room for a substantive form of empirical discovery of modal facts. At least that's what I'm going to be arguing. So what sort of gnomic necessitarianism are we talking about? Where did it come from? Why is anybody gnomic necessitarian? Well, I think we can trace quite a bit of this back to Kripke. And in the kind of post-Kripke world, kind of rocking around 1980, when metaphysics was suddenly acceptable again, and when people found they had all these essentialist beliefs about natural kind terms they didn't realize they had, people proposed extending this treatment of Kripkean treatment of natural kind terms to scientific properties generally. So just as you might get a posteriori necessity of the form water is H2O at the center of a kind of Kripkean style example, you might extend those sorts of a posteriori necessity to all scientific properties, in particular to fundamental scientific properties, such that, for example, what it is to be charged is to be the source of an electromagnetic field, something like that. You can kind of refine the roles, obviously. This is kind of scientific matter, what role exactly to associate with charge on this picture. But we found out something about the essence of charge when we found out what sorts of laws it obeys. That's the way this works. So just to be charged is to be governed by the charge laws. So taken to its kind of well worked out and sophisticated extreme in so-called dispositional essentialism or scientific essentialism, by lots of authors, too many to mention them all, but Ellis and Bird were kind of my own first window into this literature. Those authors take that Kripkean thought that we have a posteriori necessities concerning fundamental properties and add, I think, an element of dispositionality to the picture. So a commitment to seeing the very nature of those fundamental properties as dispositional. So not just asserting that there are Kripkean a posteriori necessities concerning these fundamental properties, but to conceptualize those properties as, in their essence, dispositional, and nothing else, no underlying categorical base, typically, or not necessarily, or at least not centrally an underlying categorical base. So I'm not going to kind of focus on the dispositionalist part of that story so much, because I'm interested in necessitarian views more broadly. And this Kripkean motivation for necessitarianism that gets you the kind of necessitarianism which is incorporated into dispositional essentialism is just one kind of argument. And I've mentioned 4 other kinds of arguments you might use for adopting some form of necessitarianism about laws on this slide. So Edgington appeals to nothing more really than philosophical reflection on our ordinary counterfactual thinking. But I would encourage you to read that paper. It's rich and subtle, and I haven't done it justice in that summary. Stephen Leeds, this is a kind of underappreciated paper. There's a couple of ones where he pushes a line like this. He says that our best account of objective modality comes from the state spaces of our best physical theory. And so that's where we should look to understand objective modality. And I think that's a really nice line of thinking, and I agree with that. I've added a couple of lines of thought, kind of complementary to that. In a 2013 paper, I've pushed the line that necessitarianism helps make sense of why we use modal thinking the way we do, why we use counterfactuals the way we do, in particular why we hold laws fixed in our practice of counterfactual thinking. And then in a more recent book out this year, I've argued for a particular account of modality, and necessitarianism just falls out of that account. So these are various reasons you might have for adopting necessitarianism. So on all these views, it's kind of a true thing to say that nomological modality and metaphysical modality coincide in some sense, but in precisely what sense they coincide will differ. And so this simplicity, nomological modality equals metaphysical modality, disguises the possibility of significant disagreement concerning the extension of the genuine possibilities, these nomological / metaphysical possibilities, and the kind of disagreement over whether there can be disagreement. So I think, and I want to argue, that necessitarian positions can and should, in a healthy debate, still differ radically concerning what sorts of structures of properties and laws together they acknowledge. So what sorts of kind of structural properties for the combination of laws and properties in the world there are. So I'll say a little bit to make that clearer as I go along, I hope. So starting out, I'm going to go back to this distinction between weak and strong necessitarianism and defend the stronger form. So holding fixed the view that the laws of nature are necessary, and that also holding fixed a background assumption that the laws of a world are the laws that govern the perfectly natural properties of that world. So we don't have uninstantiated laws of the world. That assumption can be waived, in which case you set things up differently. But as it stands, as I set it up, the distinction between weak and strong necessitarianism is about whether you can have alien fundamental properties that aren't actually instantiated at the actual world, that behave differently from any properties instantiated at the actual world. This distinction comes from Bird. He has a paper, an earlier paper, and then the distinction in the book. Bird doesn't endorse either weak or strong necessitarianism. He kind of floats them both. But most necessitarians that are motivated by these Kripkean ideas that I discussed earlier have been weak necessitarians, because that's all that it seems that you get straightforwardly out of the Kripkean motivation. And so these alien properties, if there were any, would be governed by alien laws. And this alien property, we can't talk about them, they're ineffable because we don't have any way to refer to them. We can say that there are some, and we can say that each of those alien properties is governed by the same laws in all the worlds in which it exists. There's a further open question for this view, whether you can have kind of duplicate law property sets. So you could have duplicate properties, which are different properties, but still enter into all structurally identical laws. So you have like duplicate sets. Again, that's not going to be the focus of my argument. The contrast with weak necessitarianism with strong necessitarianism, which, with the way I set things up, amounts to limiting the possibility of alien fundamental properties. So it's not just that the actual laws necessarily govern the properties that in fact are actual. On this view, the actual laws necessarily govern any property that there can be. So all worlds have the same law property set as the actual world on this view. So again, Bird describes this view, doesn't endorse it, but he seems to take it reasonably seriously, more seriously perhaps than many have taken it since. So lots of people like weak necessitarianism. I would wager that quite a lot of the audience right now like weak necessitarianism, or it's kind of incorporated into their broader views. But I don't like it, and I don't like it because it doesn't allow for the right sort, I think, of naturalistic discovery of modal truth. Oh dear. So, and moderate, so-called moderately naturalistic metaphysicians of the kind that Joachim were talking about yesterday may disagree with this, but I think that weak necessitarianism ultimately is going to make the space of metaphysical possibilities a wholly a priori matter, and it shouldn't be, given a suitably naturalistic approach to modality. In other words, I don't think moderate let me not talk about moderate naturalism, but I worry that weak necessitarianism doesn't allow for any kind of strong enough naturalism, because the space of genuine possibilities remains a priori. If you can get a possible law property structure just by conceiving of such a structure, I mean, if any conceivable structure corresponds to a possibility, then the law's necessity isn't a restriction on what sorts of patterns of behavior really can happen. It's a matter of what sorts of patterns of behavior can count as instances of which properties. So ultimately, weak necessitarianism is a thesis about property identity. It's not a thesis about what sorts of patterns of behavior can happen. It's just a matter of a restriction on which particular properties can do what. The overall structural possibilities are unrestricted. So here's that sort of consideration put into argument form. I'm going to go quickly because this is just really a toy to make my point in premises. First premise is suitably naturalistic necessitarianism. So that should really say a suitably naturalistic modal metaphysics, but I'm focusing on necessitarianism modal metaphysics for now. So a suitably naturalistic necessitarianism is a restrictive view about the range of objective possibilities. And weak necessitarianism is a view about property individuation. It's about which sorts of laws are linked to which properties, not about which law property combinations are possible. So weak necessitarianism ends up being a view about property individuation, not a view about the range of objective possibilities. And because it's not a view about the range of objective possibilities, it doesn't impose restrictions on that range. And so it's not a suitably naturalistic form of necessitarianism. Very simple argument. And I'm kind of curious here this is the kind of exploratory slide that I kind of put in out of curiosity. I wonder what people think about whether there's any kind of viable comparison with a dormative virtue objection to Aristotelian powers. So if you say, why does opium send you to sleep? Because it has a dormative virtue. But dormative virtue means nothing but power to send you to sleep. So the dormative virtue is characterized entirely with respect to what it is a disposition to do, a disposition to fall asleep. So that has felt to many since Molière used it as a joke to be of limited explanatory value. There's something that is not explanatorily satisfactory to say the reason opium sends you to sleep is because it has the power to send you to sleep. In the same way, it feels like it might be pseudo-explanatory to explain why, like, it's necessary that light charges repel by saying, well, this property is charge, where charge is a property such that necessarily repels other objects with that property. It seems to me like the kind of explanation you're getting out of weak necessitarianism for why a certain thing must happen is of that very weak form. There's a property identity which makes it necessary. Strong necessitarianism, on the other hand, is a much stronger restriction on I mean, it does impose a genuine restriction, not as much stronger, because the other one doesn't impose any restriction on the range of law property combinations. Strong necessitarianism does restrict that range radically. So it is a restrictive view about the range of objective possibilities. So it is, by my criterion, a suitably naturalistic form of necessitarianism. So moving on to modal discoveries, which is a kind of, it's a related argument. It's kind of, I see these two arguments as kind of two different ways of making the same general point. If you're a weak necessitarian, then the discovery of new objective impossibilities amounts to you identifying empirically which the specific actual fundamental properties are. So, like, charge is the property that necessarily obeys the charge laws. And so when you find out you've got a property around that obeys the charge laws, you're like, oh, I've got charge. And so you've got a property that necessarily obeys the charge laws in virtue of having charge and not some other property. So all you really have found out when you found out that necessarily this thing obeys the charge laws is that this thing is charge. So you found out a fact about the properties in the world. You haven't found out any restrictions on the more general space of law property combinations, kind of abstracting away from which specific properties there are in the world. So you find that the actual fundamental laws ensure that energy is conserved, then you get to you get the impressive sounding thing, violations of energy conservation are objectively impossible. But the problem is weak necessitarians still recognize other properties, very like energy, and those aren't universally conserved. It's just that those things don't count as energy. And in the presence of all those kind of nearby properties, necessarily obeying their nearby laws, the necessity that this property does its thing doesn't seem the kind of robust discovery that I think we want to be able to make in a suitably naturalistic modal metaphysics. The kind of strong modal discovery I have in mind is where you discover genuine constraints, genuine a posteriori kind of expansions and contractions of the space of possibilities. So if you discover that the actual world respects conservation of energy, then any pattern of behavior in which anything energy-like, not actually instantiated, that is not conserved is just impossible. There's no energy-like property that is not conserved. It's just not a possibility. So when you find out energy is conserved, you found out something much more substantive about modal space. So I've been articulating this contrast between weak and strong modal discoveries using certain metaphysical ideology you might not be comfortable with. I've talked about higher order properties of properties. So I've talked about kind of properties which are like energy, but not energy. And to things that they could have in common, like having the same pattern of behavior or different patterns of behavior, where that's meant to abstract away from the individual properties that feature in the pattern. So I'll say a little bit more about that later, but really this is something I'm leaving open for now to think about more in the future. So just to kind of starting to sum up, I've got a distinction here between insubstantive modal naturalism and substantive modal naturalism. So these are ways in which science can bear on our, can give us knowledge about the space of objective possibilities. And on the insubstantive form, which is associated with weak necessitarianism, scientific evidence reveals natural necessities, but it only does so in virtue of identifying the actual fundamental properties. It doesn't put any constraints on the space of possibilities abstractly considered. Whereas in substantive modal naturalism, scientific evidence can reveal natural necessities concerning what really can happen, what possible patterns of properties behavior there are, and in abstraction from property identity. So substantive modal naturalism lets us rule out energy-like things that aren't conserved as impossible, whereas insubstantive modal naturalism will never allow us to make those sorts of discoveries. So here's a version of the, here's a kind of another argument saying why we should prefer strong to weak necessitarianism. Again, it's kind of a toy. A suitably naturalistic necessitarianism should enable substantive empirical input to the range of objective possibilities. Weak necessitarianism doesn't. Strong necessitarianism does. So weak necessitarianism is not suitably naturalistic. Strong necessitarianism is. It's just a toy, but hopefully people can say which premises they reject. So here are some examples of the kinds of modal discoveries I have in mind. And how long do I have roughly left, Francesca? Have I used up all my time, or?
Yeah, you have 7 minutes, and I don't know. Yeah, we can maybe run for a couple of minutes extra into the Q&A.
No, it's fine. If I've got 7 minutes left, I must have been faster than I planned.
Yes,
which is fine. So I do have time to talk about these things, and we'll have time for some more discussion. So these are some kinds of cases where I think that science has discovered possibilities, things that were previously believed to be genuinely impossible, and are now believed to be possible, indeed actual. And some of these will be there'll be very obvious strategies for weak necessitarians and those who think that modal space is in the relevant way a priori to get out of or to explain away. Others of them I think are harder. So platypuses were, it is alleged, I don't know the detailed natural history, believed to be all the specimens imported when they were first discovered by Europeans were believed to be fake, because they were believed that it just was not possible for those types of bodily features to be combined in the way that they are. Continental drift was believed to be impossible because it was thought, especially going back a long way, that the continents are fixed and immutable. Evolution, likewise, species have often been believed to be fixed and immutable. And moving on to kind of physicsy examples, atoms. I think this is a case of discovering of possibility. It was believed to be impossible to split an atom, and it was discovered you can split an atom. Maybe that's easy to quibble with, but a harder to quibble with example is curved space-time, curved space at the top there. It was believed, and indeed vigorously argued by Kant and Kantians, that curved space-time was metaphysically impossible. We now believe it to be possible. So these are cases where I think we have rationally revised our beliefs about what is and isn't possible to bring in new possibilities. And I don't say that weak necessitarians can't handle these, but I think that the strong modal discovery conception handles these more straightforwardly. Here are some examples which I think weak necessitarianism actually has more trouble in handling. These are cases where I take actual science to have discovered some genuine metaphysical impossibilities. At least that's how the strong necessitarian would conceive of them. As in, to have discovered that certain things previously believed to be possible were not in fact possible, were not in fact metaphysically possible. And not just in terms of property identity, but in terms of what patterns of behavior. So the first of these is a picture of orbitals in an excited state of a hydrogen atom. So those are kind of probability densities for finding an electron. And at least in the ideal limit, there just is no possibility of finding the electron in a space with zero probability density, or correspondingly low. I take that to be, at least from the strong necessitarian point of view, a case where in quantum theory we discovered that certain states, certain transitions just could not happen. It was part of the nature of the system, of any possible system, that those sorts of transitions don't happen. Black holes, there are numerous, I think, interesting potential and possibilities associated there. But one straightforward one involves the event horizon. Once you're beyond the event horizon, you're not coming back out. And from a strong necessitarian, that's an objective impossibility. It's metaphysically impossible to reverse course and come back out. Have the Carnot cycle as drawn by Kelvin. Building an engine which is more efficient than the ideal Carnot engine is, I think, metaphysically impossible from a strong necessitarian point of view, and thermodynamics discovered that, and then statistical mechanics explained why. At the top there, we've got some dots flashing. That's that's a simulated kind of two-slit type experiment. So a particle kind of in the ideal limit, a particle being right in between the slits, so between the interference patterns, a particle being picked up in the middle of an interference fringe, the probability will tend to zero. It's an impossibility, but nonetheless, I think these probabilistic constraints on where the particles can go are kind of modally robust discoveries. There's probably a lot of interpretation of quantum mechanics coming into the things I said about quantum mechanics here on this slide, and I'm saying them off the cuff. It's the first time I've given this talk, so feel free to hassle me in Q&A about this. 1 minute, says Francesca, thank you. So, and also the light cone structure, I think, imposes, for a strong necessitarian, like objective necessary constraints on what sorts of causal relationships are possible. So, I've been appealing. I said I would try and say a little bit more about the ideology that I was using. I said a little bit about the idea of a structural property of a property law set. I haven't given any formal account of that in this paper. I'm not going to, but there are some ways of making it more precise around. So Mark Heller has this property counterpart theory, and Mike Hicks is currently working on a kind of updated version of that I think is well worth your attention. It's these sorts of views try to make sense of objective resemblances between properties in different worlds. So properties are counterparts of one another. We might also go just like directly for a higher order framework with higher order properties of properties, or we might look towards a direction of physics to try to characterize these sorts of things as using quantum theory as a background, and then talking about Lagrangians and equivalence classes of those. So kind of here we're talking about like different dynamical frameworks that you can embed in quantum theory. So what sorts of those are or are not possible, for example. So any other way people want to suggest of making this notion precise, very welcome. So here are these conclusions. It's all rather polemical. I mean, I would apologize, but I'm not going to apologize because I kind of among friends here, and I'm really kind of curious to hear what you all make of this sort of contrast between substantive and insubstantive modal naturalism I've been drawing. I want a modal naturalism, a modal epistemology that is more robust, that doesn't just end up being pure modal rationalism in disguise. And I think we need strong necessitarianism to do that. And that's what I tried to argue in this paper. Once we have that, we have this kind of substantive modal naturalism. Science can directly discover structural constraints and metaphysical possibility a posteriori. And so then we get like a full convergence between metaphysical modal epistemology and scientific epistemology. When we're doing science, we're just finding out what genuine possibilities there are described in the most general abstract way. And thank you. I'm done.